Thanks so much for coming to this event, which is the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences series on Social Science Matters, on the theme this year of resistance. Professor Paul Amar's visit today is sponsored by the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Department of Political Science and Legal Studies, and the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino and Latina Studies. My name is Barbara Cruikshank from the Political Science Department, and I welcome you. This project and this event is also made possible by members of the On-Protest Research Group, especially Sonia Alvarez and Martha Balaguer, who are all indispensable. And I want to thank also especially Crystal Paul for extraordinary legwork on putting this event together, as well as a panel tomorrow on on police violence and protest, which will be held in this same room from 5 to 7 tomorrow. We have a really extraordinary panel that includes Professor Amar, and he will be joined tomorrow by leading scholars in the field of police violence and protest, including Donna Murch, whose studies of Black resistance movements includes several months of research in Ferguson; Kathy Schneider, whose extended research on riots went viral with the publication of her Washington Post op-ed titled 5 Myths About Riots, which I encourage everyone to Google. It's worthwhile. And Jillian Schwedler, our beloved former colleague and faculty member who is an expert on Middle East politics, whose current research is on policing, too many P's, policing protest in Jordan. That again is tomorrow at 5 o'clock right here in the Pink Lounge. And now it is with great pleasure that I introduce our guest today, Professor Paul Amar. Amar is Associate Professor of Global Studies at UC Santa Barbara, where he is also affiliated with the Feminist Studies, Sociology, Comparative Literature, Latin American and Iberian Studies, where he also chairs the Middle East Studies program. And as you can tell already, Amar's work spans the disciplines, but it also spans the globe. His research takes him to Brazil, Egypt, the United States, back again and elsewhere. So not only his research, but the man himself is a significant site of global encounter. In previous life, Amar was a journalist, a police reformer, and sexuality rights activist in Rio de Janeiro. His activist past is evident in his many publications. He is the author or editor of 6 books and countless published essays. His most recent book, The Security Archipelago, won the American Political Science Association's Charles Taylor Best Book of the Year award. In that book, Amar dives into the torrents of resistance in Egypt and Brazil and emerges with a stunning account of new alliances of resistance in the global south that both appropriate and clash against new security regimes, free market states, and new regimes of humanitarian rescue. In his telling, the formation of the human security state demands and models the thoroughgoing reorientation of research to activism, resistance, and to politics itself. This is social science research that matters a great deal. Please join me in welcoming Paul Amar.
Oh, well, that was an amazing introduction, very embarrassing. But I'm very, very happy to be here. One of my favorite places to visit and to engage. The University of Massachusetts at Amherst has one of the most interesting and engaged political science departments, legal studies programs, gender and sexuality studies. It's a very interesting place, and I'm always glad to come here. And I'm always glad to see such a mixture of grad students, faculty, undergrads, community people, activists. So you guys are at a very special place. It's a great place to be. I teach at UC Santa Barbara, which is also a pretty fantastic place, although it couldn't be more different geographically from Massachusetts. But I feel we're kind of kindred spirits here in terms of doing interdisciplinary, engaged social science work. So I'm really glad to be here. I want to thank Barbara for all the work she did in planning, and Crystal, and then of course thanks to Marta and to Sonia and the group from the Tahrir Moments from the Protest Studies workshop, which has been so influential to me. So this paper I'm giving today, not a paper, a presentation, a loosely woven presentation, is based upon basically conversations that have come out of the conference we had a year and a half ago, Protest Studies, in which Barbara and others, we noted in our conversations that often our work at moments, working in protest studies, we're constantly referring to the hardline response of police forces to protesters, the coercive responses or the use of discretionary force by police forces responding in times of protest, social movements confronting hardline kettling practices, police brutality, new laws that allow police further discretion and control over space and bodies, and the racial and social implications of those practices. However, there's still very little work done that gets inside the self-organization within the police, the political mobilization of identities, cultural notions, institutional notions within the police in the broader historical and political context, not just in terms of individual bad apples or malfeasance or mistakes and deviance within individual units, but seeing police as, in a sense, also resistance actors, not in the sense of as resisting as brothers and sisters of progressive social movements, but as resisting changes in state norms, resisting changes in social empowerment strategies, resisting on their own terms that's different from that of the state at large or from dominant classes in general. We constantly kind of note that wouldn't it be nice if we understood a little bit better how these forms of resistance to change and resistance even to the state emerge within police forces, and how does that shape their notion of discretion and use of force and the notion of the racial makeup of society and the social antagonisms within society. But there hasn't been much work that's focused on that. So this talk today is a response to an invitation to try to begin to map out a comparative research agenda and some questions around how to think of police that are resisting, police as resistance, police even as protesters. Not to say, hey, they're just like us, the activists, no, but just to underline exactly why they often aren't at all on the same page as social movement-driven change or even state and policy-driven change. Why they are their own autonomous sphere that requires new methodologies and new frameworks for addressing police within their own histories, within their own trends, within their own social norms. So today I'm going to talk about 3 cases in which there's remarkable parallels in what's happening today. I'm going to talk about the case of Egypt, the case of Brazil, and the case of the contemporary United States, both in which I'm going to argue that police forces in each of those 3 countries are playing a major role as semi-autonomous social mobilizations tied in with rising trends towards authoritarian populism and other forms of racial populism and class populism within their countries. Populism, before we get too far, I just want to talk about that in more detail, but populism is not the same thing as progressivism, it's not the same thing as popular revolution. Populism is always a highly contradictory and rather dark set of political forces that often gesture towards the people, even as it rips the rights and claims and basis for mobilization from the people themselves. We know that in the current Republican primaries, everyone's always talking about the people need this and the people demand that and the people are angry about this and the people are enraged about that. But who are the people exactly, other than the phantoms that are evoked and conjured by that discourse itself? So populism we're going to talk about in its relationship particularly to new trends in authoritarian discourse and how actually that populism actually undermines the people's movements in reality that are making more interesting claims in these three countries themselves. So we're going to look at that role of the police in this space between the people and populism, between the state and new forms of authoritarianism. In Egypt, Brazil, and the United States. This picture here I put up at the start. This picture is from June 30th, 2013, in which we had, in which I was actually in this protest, along with 10 million other people, literally, in Egypt, which was a protest which mixed utterly contradictory and opposite motivations. A protest against the government of Muslim Brotherhood President Mohamed Morsi, who had been elected and then had faced resistance from both the left and the right. But in the end, this protest, in the end, one of the leaders of this protest on June 30th ended up being the much hated police forces, who decided to join the people and lead the people. Of course, if I had known that, I probably wouldn't have shown up, but somewhere in those 10 million people, the police were leading this protest, and the police had actually declared strike against the state and mobilized the entire force of the police forces in Egypt, and there's more than 1 million police officers in Egypt joining this protest, and they ended up toppling the government and installing a then mixed military and police government. As of day before yesterday, these same police forces that have now formed a police union have now hinted that they might now join forces to overthrow the current military dictatorship in Egypt, because they don't feel that the police are getting their enough discretion, enough sovereignty, enough free reign over society as they wish. So Egypt is a very interesting case in which we think of protesters in Tahrir Square. We think maybe of the mobilization of the military in the current moment as they declare this war on terror and repress the activists. But the police, as an autonomous variable, as an autonomous social actor, from the beginning, from the days before the overthrow of President Mubarak to today, has been decisive in its autonomy and its strategizing as a separate organization with its own goals and its own culture, its own brutal practices of social expropriation and protection in the city is something that needs its own attention. Anyway, so I just start with that gesture of these police in Egypt that are such an incredibly important story, but have dropped out of almost every account of the story of the Arab Spring and of Egypt. And we're going to see how that plays out and how it actually can teach us about some of the things happening in the United States and in Brazil, and of course in the context of the mobilizations around police brutality in Ferguson, in Baltimore, in Springfield, in New York, and the new movements amongst police in the United States, often to push back against those protests, push back, generating a discourse of resistance to thugs and the mobilization of Blue Lives Matter, right? The police rights movement that wants to displace the Black Lives Matter movement and put instead an autonomous, sovereign role for the police in society. So we're at a very crucial moment in terms of the need for a new kind of police studies. We're also at a crucial movement in terms of the amazing success in mobilization of new kinds of movements around racial policing and brutal policing. So this is not a pessimistic talk, although at times it's going to seem to be focusing on lots of very troubling authoritarian developments. But the only reason I want to underline in advance why we're seeing these kind of incredible mobilizations amongst some right-wing elements within these police forces is because there has been such a higher level of scrutiny and such an incredible global as well as national set of mobilizations around exposing the problems of policing. So in general, what I want to return to in this talk are about 3 different questions. One is, as we've been talking about, is how to retune the methods of social science that are adapted to look at social movements, at protest movements, at civil rights movements, and what happens when you use those methodologies instead to look at what are often seen as static or simply kind of mechanical expressions of the forces of coercion that are simply responding to protests and then slamming back with too much force. Well, what if we take that responsive coercive apparatuses and analyze it as a social movement itself? We analyze it in terms of the mobilization of certain identities. We look at the social context of their economic and political grievances, and then trace them historically in a comparative context. Two, I want to look at, in each of these three cases, briefly, the political, economic, and some of the cultural forces that are shaping police into more aggressively as protesters themselves, as in this case kind of authoritarian protesters, and as populist forces of resistance, again, mobilizing certain forms of rather conservative populism. This will help us explain what we saw in the protests in Chicago against Rahm Emanuel and against Trump, and the representations of police as resisting what they see as attempts to shut down free expression, kind of turning inside out of civil rights and freedom of expression discourse by this new mode of police populism. Third, we're going to insert these new forms of populism and coercive sovereignty into social histories and racial geographies in terms of the languages used. For instance, I'm going to talk about the global circulation of new discourses around the thug. All right? The thug as the proud masculine police enforcer, and the thug as the object of police enforcement that justifies more a heavier use of force because of potential for rioting, potential for broader social violence. So these are three things we're going to look at. As I talked about earlier, this is an attempt to retune resistance scholarship and to get beyond its previous trajectories, its previous research focal points. As we talked about, and of course the people in this room that work on protest scholarship, of course, are much more nuanced and much more imaginative in their way of seeing social movements. But typically, in social movement studies, in people studying civil rights movements or protest movements, the police are seen as kind of the reaction of the state and the coercive apparatus in a kind of mechanical or instrumental way. We want to get beyond that and see them in their context. Or police are simply seen in terms of the way their institutions produce a particular set of values, a particular set of norms. We need to reform those norms so that they're more tolerant of diversity, so that they understand things from the African American's perspective, or so that they're more sensitive to the needs of women or LGBT minorities. That kind of cultural normative approach is where most reformist approaches to policing come from. We need to do sensitivity training. We need to have more trust and openness between communities. It's seen as kind of a cultural perception that needs to be tweaked, which I think is a kind of a weak liberal discourse, although of course there's no reason to throw that out, but it doesn't explain the deep shifts we're seeing in practices and use of force. The third thing is an individualistic approach that is often tied to reformist practices, or it's tied, to kind of psychosocial or therapeutic approaches, where police are seen as, of course, precarious professionals that are in a precarious field, high risk, high contact, needing to constantly negotiate complex social situations. They're also in a precarious field, in which precarious in terms of they're vulnerable to, difficult labor practices, labor regulations, shifting if in certain contexts such as France or Brazil, they can be moved, or Egypt, they can be randomly moved hundreds of miles away from their homes and placed in contexts where they feel this kind of precarious bewilderment. So an individualistic approach will look at cops that have gone wrong as cops that are kind of experienced kind of precariousness and a risk that basically freaks them out and causes them to respond too aggressively. Again, that's not necessarily wrong, necessarily right, but its individual focus isn't adequate to seeing large-scale changes, and of course the rise of particular forms of populist politics or racial attitudes. And finally, some more interesting approaches is, of course, looking at police in terms of the economic and politicized economic shifts within those forces. This is a lot of the movements coming out of the Ferguson uprisings and unrest focus on the channeling of millions of dollars of grants for anti-terror military armament and weaponry into an area that has no terrorist presence, and so how those economic incentives produce more militarized police force. That's something that can be more interesting for social movement studies, looking at police as a social movement in its shifting context of economic opportunities. So in this, as I go through these case studies now, we're going to move beyond those for the most part, the individualistic, the cultural reformist approach, and the kind of precarity of the business focuses on individuals basically losing control. And we're going to, of course, look at police's social movements in the context of populism. We're going to look also specifically at this increasing tendency of police to turn inside out the language of civil rights and popular sovereignty in order to claim a kind of inverted notion of police rights being the real people's rights that the police can claim against popular movements themselves. So this is this kind of populism that's actually a popular sovereignty turned inside out. Popular sovereignty means the people claiming control of their space, insisting on their dignified participation in the forms of economic and political reality that make their social spaces and their economic realities popular sovereignties, people declaring that their will, their political subjectivity needs to be grounded and expressed in a participatory framework in the spaces they inhabit. So we're looking at how that's turned inside out by some of these new police populist movements. So now I'm going to move to case studies so that this stuff can be a little bit more grounded, and you can see some interesting. I think I'm not going to make a kind of hardcore variable by variable comparative analysis, but I think just by highlighting some of the parallel trends and sketching out some of the connecting fibers between these very disparate countries that are experiencing some remarkable parallel trends almost week to the week in terms of how these police forces are responding on the ground. It at least raises new questions about both the local context of police as resistance and the global frameworks in which police are being given in more space to mobilize autonomously. So in a 2-minute summary of the history of police in Egypt, police as Egypt, for instance, is the largest Arab country, 100 million people. It's in the center of the Middle East, at the center of trade routes with the Suez Canal that connects the Mediterranean to Africa to the Indian Ocean. It's also a strategic power right next to Israel, and on the other side is Libya, and below that is Sudan, and on the other side is Saudi Arabia. So it is strategically very important next to these spaces that are in conflict. It was also the second Arab revolution in the Arab Spring era after Tunisia, in which we had millions and millions of people participating in uprisings. But police in Egypt have a long history as resistance actors in the political imagination and in popular culture. In 1952, just before the military-led anti-colonial revolution in Egypt, there was an attempt by police. Police declared a strike against the British colonial masters in Egypt. And this was a very famous strike in January in 1952, which police officers refused to comply with the orders coming from the British colonial authorities and refused to implement them. So January 25th, in memory of that resistance that came before the then revolution led by junior military officers like Gamal Abdel Nasser, so the January 25th was declared Love the Police Day in celebration for the day that the police really did act as resistance forces against the colonial power of Britain and acted in the voice of the people, in this case literally an anti-colonial popular sovereignty independence movement in 1952. Now during the then Egypt was then under military rule starting later in 1952, and it did throw out the British, this time with the military's help. Then paradoxically, the military leader, a left populist, a revolutionary third worldist leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, because even though he came from a military background and he had been a leader of the military coup against the British, he was very suspicious himself that the military was going to throw him out. So Gamal Abdel Nasser encouraged the police to grow larger and larger and more independent and more dependent on him as an individual, as president. So Gamal Abdel Nasser trained the police to think of themselves as resistance tied to the people and suspicious of the military, who were constantly thinking perhaps of themselves and their own institutional interests. So there's a long history in Egypt of the police being not just all part of the same coercive state apparatus, but having a kind of role as sometimes standing outside and getting ready to maybe overthrow the state in a very interesting and contradictory way. So the police were built up by Nasser. The police state, in the end, became a very repressive police state. But it wasn't just about repression. It always had in its back pocket the idea that it was going to be able to resist the military state or the bureaucratic state if it needed to overthrow a kind of dominant faction. So this has always been in that resistance, and I think you'll find this in many cultures. Police are not just like the arm of the law. They're not just reflecting, a kind of state of social control, but they have their own histories, their own legends, and their own identities. Sometimes an identity as resistance to the state itself, which might sound contradictory in a simple sense, but in terms of real institutional practice, it's very powerful. So then, starting in the 1990s, police started to become more autonomous in Egypt because of this practice of privatization and neoliberalism and a kind of informalization of the economy and wealth flowing through these informal and sometimes semi-criminal, transnational trafficking networks, kind of free zone shipping of products manufactured in Egypt out to China or into Europe to avoid tariffs. There are a lot of kind of, under Sadat's IMF-imposed liberalization scheme, there was many informal economies with a lot of wealth flowing through them, and police became the arbiters of many of these informal economic practices, became the kind of protection racket and business managers, and in the end, the kind of gatekeepers of these informal economies. So they're involved in microcredit enforcement, these new kinds of loans circulating through the working class economy, which are not backed up by collateral, they're just backed up by direct police enforcement. If you don't pay your credit, the police come to your house and insist you do. So police became involved in these new forms of liberalization and credit and informal economies, and of course they became closer and closer connected with forms of vice and trafficking. And this became a real dilemma for the state. The state, by the late 80s, was starting to freak out that police were more and more involved in these new globally articulated trafficking and money laundering and credit management economies. And so the state tried to crack down in the late 1980s. The police rose up in a very famous uprising in 1986. Amna Markezi, the Central Security Police Forces, rose up and tried to overthrow the state. And it took more than a month for the state to repress that uprising of the police against the state, because the state wanted to force the police to cut off their connection to informal markets. So here we have just 3 periods within one generation in which the police were not, they were brutal police and they were police that had some propensity towards corruption, but they were also often mobilizing directly to overthrow the state. So this is something that, again, authoritarianism studies and dictatorship studies kind of doesn't imagine, that you have in an authoritarian society, the police are trying to overthrow the state, but the police are also the agents of the worst element of the state. So it's something that actually happens more often than we think, but it just is blurry and not studied by either activists or scholars, because we just see the police as the thin blue line between the state and us, but actually it's a pretty thick blue space with its own history and its own dynamics. So, of course, who here still remembers the Tahrir Square uprising in Cairo in 2011? Good. Time is going so fast and there's so much bad news, but there was a time of really, really good news. 2011, for many of us, was such a great year. And it began, one could argue, as basically a revolt against police brutality, right? It was a 10 million strong Ferguson uprising in Cairo. The January 25th in Egypt and the Arab world, we don't call it the Arab Spring, we don't call it Tahrir Square uprisings, we call it the January 25th Revolution. Now, who remembers what January 25th was designated as?
No Police Day.
Right? Love the Police Day. So, Mubarak after a set of several years of scandals of police brutality, such as the Khaled Saeed case, in which you had a young man in an internet cafe who refused to pay a police bribe, was dragged out of the internet cafe and beaten until his skull was smashed into fragments. That's the picture on the right, and this became an image of police brutality and corruption that animated the country. The police had also several times killed masses of working class soccer fans, ultras, in major riots from 2008 forward. The police had also been involved in burning Sufi shrines and repressing Sufi collectives. And police had also been implicated in the mass shooting of Sudanese and Somali refugees gathered outside of asylum offices of the United Nations offices in Cairo. So the police had both a class and a youth and a corruption and a race relations crisis happening in Egypt. And so in the middle of all this, all these controversies, we then had Mubarak, who was basically, by that point, the protesters had been calling him the thug king of the thug state. Right? The protesters were calling Mubarak and his police the thug state. And I'll talk a little bit later how the word thug might not come from where you think it does, but it comes from the Middle East, from India through the Middle East to Jamaica to the United States. So the word thug, called thuggy, which is not the same as thug, but it has a homonymic relationship with the word thug, became the name for Mubarak's state, the thug state. And the mobilizations then, when Mubarak had the audacity to then give everyone a day off, which didn't usually happen, but he actually gave everyone in the country a day off on Love the Police Day because he really wanted the country to restore its faith in the police. So of course that day, the country did take a day off and came down to Tahrir Square, but for the opposite reasons, to basically demand that the thug state be dismantled, that the police thugs be removed, and that the people, the people want the overthrow of the regime. But that was specifically one of the main focuses was on the elimination of the police and police brutality. So the Arab Spring was very much an anti-police brutality uprising in many of its dimensions, and the fact that Egypt's revolution began January 25th, Love the Police Day, is incredibly important. It wasn't on the day that the labor union was ratified, which was another big day, a big protest. It wasn't on the day that the Muslim Brotherhood had its closed elections, or you can think of many other days that happened similar to that period, but it was a police day that freaked everyone out. So then after that, we had this kind of dialogue with the population. How was the police going to be seen by this population that was rising up in part against the police? So there was an attempt kind of in the early stages to embrace the police with love, kisses and flowers to see if they would disarm themselves and join the people. In the end, the military joined the people for the moment and pushed the police back. The police, by the end of the 18 days of Tahrir Square uprising, the police basically began to go on strike. Even by a few days into the protest, police started to back away and to basically go on strike throughout the country, allowing for prisons to be opened, people to take over police stations, burn them down. And off and on, the police were on strike, off and on for the next 2 years, causing the government, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood or the military, to be constantly embarrassed by this chaotic situation. So again, the whole experience of the uprisings in Egypt, if you reread it, around the way the police were either pulling themselves back or slamming themselves forward, or the way that the state was trying to frame the role of the police in society, it's a very different revolution. It's still just as exciting, maybe even more brave and more exciting, but you have to look at that third variable of what the police are doing. The fact that for 2 years, revolutionary movements were able to move throughout the city, occupy police stations, even go into the interior ministry and open up the file cabinets. The police were basically they just walked away. And they were right. By walking away long enough, people started to beg them, please come back. Please, please, please come back. Please come back. Eventually, the middle classes and other groups started to beg the police to come back and would basically write them a blank check. You know, if you would come back, you can do anything you want. We desperately want you back. So the whole story of Arab Spring in Egypt needs to have that component of the police resisting and the police manipulating the relationship between the people and the state. The youth have continued, younger people, even children, ages of 7 to 16, have been key in keeping up throughout all these phases this insistence that we focus on the police being the problem, not the solution in the social injustice in Egypt. You see everywhere, you'll see all over Egypt ACAB, which is an English acronym. Does anyone know what ACAB means? Yeah. Right. All cops are bastards. So yeah, this is a international expression coming from basically soccer fans responding to police repression of soccer fans. But ACAB you'll see all over the revolutionary graffiti in Egypt, and it's basically a kind of English acronym version of the kind of critique of the thug police state of Mubarak. You can see all these police officers have little Mubarak heads here, right there. And you can see above there, there's this idea that Mubarak and the military generals are actually the same thing, and they're all protected by the police. So this is kind of like the graffiti that renders the state, in a sense, as one big monolith. Mubarak, the military, the police are all one big thug apparatus. But actually, this graffiti is much too simplifying. In fact, the military, the police, the elite ended up often wanting to strangle each other, and that's maybe why the revolution was so dynamic, because these actors were constantly at each other's throats. One of the major movements to critique and reform the police were around gender issues, where the police specifically singled out women for brutal treatment, and often spectacular kind of demonstrations of brutality against women protesters. The idea of to get rid of women protesters would be to get rid of the kind of legitimate people's voice in a protest. If a protest is all men, then even the Egyptian state can represent it as a bunch of rabble-rousing terrorists. Even the Egyptian state is Islamophobic when it comes to its own protesters, but if it's women of different classes, of different colors, of different backgrounds, then the state can't just throw them all out as a bunch of terrorists. So the role of getting rid of women from protests was a main goal of the police. And to a certain extent, it did succeed in terrorizing women protesters. But to conclude the case on Egypt, actually, as I said just a couple days ago, starting in February 8th, in my favorite neighborhood, Dar al-Ahmar, a very popular working class neighborhood, that throughout the 80s and 90s was a center for very intense social struggle between working classes and police. It's often called like the South Bronx of Cairo. Very popular, very fun neighborhood, but also full of unrest between the police and landlords and the population. So we thought this was a time of kind of repression and quiet and submission because of the role of the military and the police being so strong after the revolution. But actually we had an uprising in this Dar al-Ahmar area, something that would be very familiar to us in the United States. We had a guy who was driving his kind of taxi motorcycle, and a policeman stopped him, and the policeman asked for the guy to give him a ride and to take a bunch of stuff that actually the policeman was like selling illegally on the next street corner, and to like take him and all this stuff. And the guy driving the taxi said like, well, okay, I'll do it, but you got to pay me, this is my living. And so the policeman accused him of resisting arrest because he didn't give him a free ride and shot him in the head 3 times. And of course, unfortunately, this happens very often in a kind of police extraction protection racket state, but the police are not just brutal and have impunity, but they also run these informal smuggling economies often. But what was amazing is the people mobilized in the neighborhood. Tens of thousands of people actually came down from Dar al-Ahmar and walked down the main street in Dar al-Ahmar to the police, to the Mudiriyat al-Amn, which is like the police and intelligence headquarters in the neighborhood. And they surrounded it and occupied it. And eventually, even the military general Sisi came to side with the people because he realized that before that, the doctors' syndicate had mobilized by the thousands against the police because the police were coming in and had killed 14 medical doctors in Egypt because the medical doctors had refused to generate fake forensic reports on victims of police violence and torture. 14 doctors had been shot in the head because they didn't produce fake forensic reports. They had done the same thing with lawyers. If lawyers were trying to defend people that the police didn't like, then the lawyers had been shot. So we had lawyers and uprisings, doctors and uprisings, and then we had the people rise up. So finally the leader, the general who's now the elected president, sided with the people, and he actually, after all these uprisings, revolutions, a military authoritarian leader passed an aggressive police reform law on March 12th, right now. Which then then the police have responded to threatening to go on strike and to overthrow the military government. So we have police as resistance as a huge factor in these changes in Egypt. So, but the good news is that even in authoritarian polity, even when police are truly grotesque in their use of force, we have change happening, and we have the police in a sense on a back step and claiming that they want to protect the people, they want to win the people's respect back. But in any case, only understanding that dynamic of triangulation can we understand the reality. So I want to talk a little bit about Brazil, which is also right now an incredible crisis, and in which the role of police in the overuse of force in a highly conflictual polity is really very urgent right now, and something that sometimes looks very much like the U.S., but in other ways looks like a moment which could be the United States' future, in which a mix of police discretionary force and a very right-wing political rhetoric. In the United States, we of course have racial politics that infiltrates police violence, but as we'll see, it only has begun to be coded as an explicit police political platform with a particular ideology. But in Brazil, that particular ideology is becoming very, very, meaning that there's literally a political movement behind the brutality in Brazilian police, and it's explicitly a fascist one. So I know I've been speaking a long time, so I don't want to go into too much of the detail of the history, but of course history is always very important to see why police do what they do. In Brazil, police, until relatively recently, until the 30s or 40s, were just like the Rangers in the United States. They're basically private militias run by wealthy landowners that just caught slaves and shot people that would try to get in to plantations and coffee plantations or to landed estates. So really police, in terms of, there was a modern military, but in terms of a regular civil police force that came, evolved, it existed, but it was not ostensible and visible in the streets until later. So, but these slave-catching bands that became the military police in Brazil, there was a continuity, literally like the stations, which are called battalions. The battalions in, for example, Rio de Janeiro are often exactly the same buildings that were the outposts at the edge of the coffee plantations for going and catching slaves and bringing them back. Sometimes the same buildings. So the continuity from the slave catchers to the military police today is often direct. And still in many of these battalions you have the influence of a very particular family that used to be the big landowner in that area, and often their will is expressed directly in what the commander of the battalion decides to do with the police. And as we found more recently, with the proliferation of the militia movement, we're back to having literally private organized militias that have branched off from private police and retired military police that are turning out to be exactly like the old slave catcher militias with some new, even more disturbing political ideologies. So in 1985, at the end of the military dictatorship, many activists were hoping that finally the military police, the former slave catchers, would be integrated into the Brazilian federal justice system and would become part of the federal, would be like kind of local versions of the FBI in the United States. The United States, of course, has an incredibly localized and provincialized police system, right? Every city, every county has its own police. But in Brazil and in many countries, the idea of modernization is often based on the idea that everyone will be part of a national interior ministry or national justice ministry framework. The police were left out of this framework, and not just left out of this framework, but they were also completely allowed to have each province was allowed to maintain its own philosophy of the police, its own norms of the police, basically allowed to police to keep doing their dirty work in the interests of local officials as a kind of loophole in the democratic constitution at the end of the military dictatorship. Since then, there's been, in the most recent period, since year 2002, there's been a proliferation of new kinds of policing. The pacification police, which is the UPP, the Unidade de Policiamento de Pacificação Policial, pacificador. All right, so but units of pacifying policing in Brazil, which are a very progressive version, lasted about a couple years, that was actually separated from the military police tradition, although ended up being reabsorbed by the military police and eventually by corruption pretty quickly. But I just want to talk a little bit about some of the disturbing ideological and movement trends within the police that have been showing up very clearly and recently. We have this return toward a sense of kind of a unionization, not necessarily in the good sense, of police in the sense that they're creating blocks that will strike and will resist demands for reform from the state or demands for justice and human rights from the people. We had the police commander-in-chief of the Special Ops Unit, the BOP, which is the Batalhão de Operações Especiais, the Special Operations, Special Ops Unit of the police in Rio de Janeiro, explicitly, kind of Trump style, explicitly tweeting fascist quotes from Hitler and Mussolini, and explicitly mobilizing fascist, not just quotes, but entire philosophical treatises of fascism and racial supremacy within this is the chief of Rio de Janeiro's special ops units, which had always had this kind of machismo, ultra, literally this is the flag of the special ops unit, right? Not like a slang or cartoon. That's literally what's on every police car as it drives past you, is the skull and pistols. So he was revealed to be literally a Nazi, and was removed, but then eventually exonerated. We have the emergence of new kinds of militias, which are even more impunity than the police themselves. But even worse, now they have a very extreme Christian Pentecostal mobilizing ideology that gives them not just a kind of independent policing force, but that also gives them a kind of messianic missionary appeal. So this is the gladiators of the altar from the Universal Church, Pentecostal Church in Rio de Janeiro. So starting to mobilize, first it seemed, okay, they're just kind of doing a masculinity restoration thing through Christianity, but then they started to merge with armed militia groups. So, it's, Christian groups, again, are not immune to this militarization process. And we have this kind of spectacular kind of worship of these Christian militia police commanders. This is a former police commander that became a kind of star who, his chest tattoo says, there only exists one man, God. So, strangely, that's kind of almost what you say to become a Muslim, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so, he's represents this kind of, obviously, a kind of hypermasculinity, a kind of modern consumer, theology of prosperity kind of guy. He's a strict Christian evangelical leader and also a former colonel in the military police who now runs his own private militia squad missionary deployment, who was then shot and killed in one of his operations. So leading the celestial militia. So this mix of new forms of religious ideology, fascism, racial supremacy, a mix of a kind of shift from a time in which there was some really amazingly successful attempts to put the police back into the constitutional framework, to change the police in order to overcome and face head-on their racial legacies and their connections to plantation slavery in the past. That has now kind of turned back as we have a very strong right-wing reaction, which is not just enforced by new police actions, but literally is being bred within the police and the militias as a new school of thought about politics, as a new way to talk about God, about the people, about masculinity. So it's not just the police are enforcing a Brazilian political shift, but the police themselves are the heart of the laboratory for generating the new ideologies and also for embodying them. You know, when people think of the police, they're not thinking of them as a reflex of the state, they're thinking of them as a zone, in this sense, of a kind of fantasy of reconciliation between God, masculinity, wealth, and power. So it's very, very disturbing and powerful force. So in the United States, of course, as we know, we are facing some parallels and also some important differences. Again, the points I want to make about the United States, especially in comparison with these two cases of extreme social polarization, are not meant to say that the American police are the same as Brazilian or Egyptian police, but to point out that there are some trends that we need to be very attentive to and to think very carefully about, to add to our conversations around race and around force and around accountability. Of course, we all know that the figure of police militarization and police racism and community alienation in Ferguson and Missouri, as well as elsewhere, including Springfield here, has been an important subject for new and creative forms of mobilization in the civil rights movement and the post-civil rights movement. Black Lives Matter movement, which is not the same as the civil rights movement. It's much more direct action, in a sense, focused on deep transformation of attitudes and institutions. So we have some resemblances in terms of this shift towards focusing on the police and on new forms of populist direct force violence as a political ideology in the United States. But we also have what I want to focus on, and we need to be very attentive to, is we do have this increasing trend toward explicit identification of autonomous movements and kind of an independence from both the state and the law amongst police identities in this country, which is a very troubling trend. After the protests around the chokehold murder of Garner in New York, we then had the killing of 2 police officers in the end of 2014. Too many notes about the date. Rafael Ramos, Wenjin Liu. And in the funerals for these 2 police officers, as you might remember, we had police officers giving their back to Mayor of New York de Blasio, which was a kind of course, the New York police have a history of autonomy and kind of proud, distance from both the economic elites and sometimes the political elites in New York. But this was a remarkable moment, and it wasn't just a moment, because after this, the police individuals in that movement turning their back on de Blasio because de Blasio had facilitated a quote-unquote thug revolution. His cops called the uprisings in Times Square and throughout New York, demanding justice for Eric Garner as a thug revolution, a thug revolt. And in response to the thug revolt, which they identified with Black Lives Matter, of course we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the word thug and how important that is, they founded this new movement called Blue Lives Matter. Now, Blue Lives Matter is a case of this inversion of civil rights and human rights discourse, right? Where you have the focus on Blue Lives Matter, blue lives meaning that police are now the victims, not the perpetrators of violence. Police and they literally use the metaphor of race. They're advocating the passage of laws that declare it a hate crime if you target someone because of the color of their uniform. So there is literally an understanding that of like somehow the blue uniform is a kind of racial prejudice, like prejudice around blackness or around people of color. So it's a very interesting and American, fascinating inversion, right? We have the using hate crimes law saying if you target, again, using this one case of a mentally disturbed individual who killed 2 police as if it were the protesters around Eric Gardner or the Black Lives Movement that had, killed 2 police to focus the attention on murderousness of protesters. And therefore Blue Lives Matter comes in a direct attempt to displace Black Lives Matter and to displace the rights of protesters with the rights of police. And the police have a right to protect themselves against free expression using their free expression. So it's something we saw like in the Trump protests, right? That Trump's rallies have a right to the free expression of violence, and if you try to stop that free expression of violence, then you're repressing people's free expression. It's this inside-out human rights discourse, which is almost always connected to a displacing of racial claims. In this case, we have this spectacular displacement from black to blue, which is taken quite literally as a shift away from concerns for blackness towards concerns for the inviolability of police apparatuses. And you see these kind of rather scary New York politicians lining up behind it. Also in the United States, and again, it kind of just jumps out at you how much this reminds us of Brazil and its evangelical police militias. So we have this connected to Blue Lives Matter, this a very Christian movement, which is again this kind of mixture of like identifying with God and a missionary mission. And of course, this is a line that of course comes from Christ, but of course, in the American context, this is one of Martin Luther King's great speeches, "Blessed are the peacemakers," which was made at a time of resisting incredible police violence in the South. Martin Luther King using this line. Now it's turned inside out. "Blessed are the peacemakers" is a right-wing Christian movement next to parallel with the Blue Lives Matter movement, generating a kind of religious mission for police and protecting their autonomy. Now, the logos for the Blessed are the Peacemaker movement is not very pacifist, right? You have, used to be, if you look a couple years ago, this helmet thing was more like a knight's helmet, a helmet of honor. It's progressively become much more like a skull. And just like in Brazil, you have these weapons. And of course, the peacemaker is also anybody know what else a peacemaker is? It's a Colt 45, right? So it's also gun fetishism. So this isn't the peacemaker of Martin Luther King's discourse, right? Or of Jesus Christ's discourse. This has been remade as a particular kind of badge of violence that's Christianized and made into kind of an evangelical fervor. So this is something, again, this reminds me a lot of what's going on in these other countries. It's not nearly at the extent it is in those other countries, but it's something that we need to think about and we need to understand in its context. So let me just to conclude a little bit, I want to shift to the realm of, we've talked about the shifting institutional roles of police, we've talked about a little bit about the role of religion, masculinity, and increasing autonomy of police, which have been absolutely decisive in social change in Egypt. Resisting police are now very important in Brazil in terms of repressing youth protests, in terms of high levels of racial extermination, which is called genocide by black movement protesters in Brazil, and now explicitly Brazil police identification with fascist and very right-wing Pentecostal ideologies. But one thing I want to look at, that's something I've been doing a little bit of special research on, is this way we've kind of, in this age of police autonomy, we've seen a shift, although It's not going to be as clean a shift in the last couple of days, but a shift from focusing so much on the terrorist as the object of the police state and security state, but on this figure of the thug that's constantly coming up in discourse, justifying police violence, dismissing and undermining the legitimacy of protesters against police, re-racializing and demeaning political protest in general. But we remember that back in 2011, the movements of the social revolutions against the police states were using the term thug to talk about the state, to talk about the authoritarian police state. The thug state in Egypt was the object of the revolution. We had discourses about thugs and crony capitalists, about violent billionaires and their thuggish minions. There was a discourse just a few years ago in which the thug was the people on top that were leading repression of popular movements and of human rights, social justice movements. And we've seen this back and forth flip of the use of the word thug. It's become so, the word terrorist now has been so fully Islamized and so fully inserted into the language of Islamophobia and connected with a particular political and militarized political struggle that it almost doesn't work in the popular imagination, even in the Middle East itself, except for to describe Islamism and that form of militarized resistance. So terrorism is, although it dominated 20 years of our political culture, it's now, because of its very unfortunate and very brutal kind of fusing with the misperceptions of Islam itself, it doesn't seem to work to look at anything but Islamism or the racialization of Arabs and Muslims. So thug, in a sense, has come to stand in certain ways, for a particular, as a substitute, as the object of police and military mobilization, but of course picking up on a completely different racial and class history than that of a terrorist. So let's look back a little bit where this word thug comes from, because I think it's very important to be conscious of it. When I ask a lot of people, in the U.S. where the word thug comes from, of course, there's an assumption that it's an African-American slang term. It comes from the American vernacular, but it actually has a very long political history, which is very interesting, and it can really globalize our consciousness if we're more aware of it. The word thug itself comes from Hindi, basically meaning social bandit, or a kind of sinister, kind of tricky person who